Hey, everybody, it's Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. Hey, we're going to have a good one today. It's going to be a lot of fun. A guy named Jay Bushman, who's a Hollywood writer, literary big brain. I mean, I was talking with this guy. I'm barely able to keep up because he's so damn smart. He's read everything. He's written a book called Novel Advice, Practical Wisdom for Your Favorite Literary Characters. And basically, Antigone is his advice columnist, right? If you don't know who Antigone is, look that up. Antigone is giving advice to Goethe, all these characters from history, and kind of advising them on what they should do in their actual real life situation. And so we take that and we go with it and we explore the topic. And I know it's just a lot of fun. And I know you're going to just look, even if you're not into literature, you're going to dig the chat because it's really funny. And all of these archetypical characters that we see out there, what if they got advice from somebody, and what happens next? Look, Jay's done a bunch of things in Hollywood. He's done an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice called the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. If you're in on Pride and Prejudice, you understand why that's kind of funny. Welcome to Sanditon is another thing he's done. He likes to take and put traditional characters in different contexts. That's sort of what he does. He's also a writer and producer with Fourth Wall Studios. So take a look at them. They've won a bunch of Emmys for things like Dirty Work and Airship Dracula. You'll love this episode. It's so much fun. Hey, if you want to support us, one of the things I'm doing right now is prepping for or either on the road for the Ride for the Brave. Yep, it's been about a year. Scott and I are going to go back out and raise money for Save the Brave on the road. You can always support us. Just look on our Facebook feed or Instagram. You'll find ways to do that. Or you can just go to savethebrave.org, hit the donate tab and throw some money in. We're going to raise $5,000 every time we stop. We're stopping at Harley-Davidson dealerships from San Marcos, California, all the way to Miami. We love Miami. All right, so that's going to be what the Ride for the Brave is for. That's how we're going to do that. Why are we doing that? Because we're trying to end veteran suicide. It's plain and simple. Trying to get people out and work in service. And I encourage you to help us because you know how hard we work. Hey, speaking of working hard, you can support the Break It Down Show by hitting the PayPal link. Go to breakitdownshow.com. Look at that PayPal link right there at the top. You see it? Click on that. Put a little bit of money in the pocket each month. I will put that money to work. You know me. And if you don't know me, hey, I'm Pete. I'm your friend. I work hard and I could use your help. $5, $10, $25, $100. I've gotten amounts of all kinds. If it's a one-time thing, great. If you're going to do it when you can, great. If you're going to do something every month, great. If you have an old subscription, you're like, you know what? I really need to turn that thing off. Stop giving money to them, especially if you don't know them. And give it to me instead. Just take that subscription, turn it off for them, put it in my pocket. I promise I will put it to work. I'm not going to get rich doing this. I'm just trying to get out and do more crazy things, get on the road and go do the things that only I can do. Help me out with that. What do you think? All right, here we go. Here comes Jay Bushman.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Jay Bushman, and you're watching The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Jay, you've written a fantastic book, and what you do is something that is near and dear to my heart. I love how you take things that exist and kind of reconstitute them into fantastic works of art. It's just great. So I was just had Rob Paulson on the show the other day. I don't know if you know Rob, but Rob's a very, very well-known voice actor. He's done 2 of the 4 Mutant Ninja Turtles. He's Yakko from the Animaniacs.
Right,
Yeah. Pinky from Pinky and the Brain. Yeah. And I'm like, let's take Carl Weezer, one of his characters, and make him now a middle-aged man, and it's like, oh, I got a prostate like Idaho potato.
Nice.
Yeah, but you do a similar thing. I mean, I don't want to minimize what you do because it's an incredible practice, but to kind of deconstruct these characters. When did you started doing this early, I'm betting, but when did you start figuring out that you had a knack for this?
A long time ago. I think the first place that this became apparent to me that I was interested in sort of the intersection of characters and stories in different mediums. When I was in high school, every year the school would put on a musical. And the year that I was a senior, the musical was Little Shop of Horrors. And I don't know what possessed the director to say yes to this, but I was very, very excited by the idea of going back to the original Roger Corman black and white horror movie, Little Shop of Horrors, and taking scenes from that and putting it in the musical. And for whatever reason, they said yes. So we ended up performing this version of Little Shop, probably highly not legal at all, but we did this version of Little Shop of Horrors with all of these scenes from the original Roger Corman version. And so just ever since then, I just have been really interested in how stories are told in different ways, in different formats, and mashing them up and mixing and matching them.
I'm gonna put the link up for your book, but basically it's novel advice, practical wisdom for your favorite literary characters. We can get that on Amazon. If you use that link, we'll get a little taste of that, and we'll all appreciate it. I want to explore the idea though, because it's really limitless. I mean, well, Hollywood loves sequels. You're a producer, you're a showrunner, you know this. And when you look at what we could do as sequels, we could have a dark comedy or a thriller. I mean, like, what does Harry Potter do next? He's the high school kid who peaked and didn't even really graduate high school, as far as I know. I mean, maybe he did. It seemed kind of like he didn't, though,
I've heard it questioned online in several places that there really isn't any education past Hogwarts in the wizarding world. You just go to high school and then that's it. And then apparently you end up always marrying your high school sweetheart. God, I'm, glad that's not how it is in the real world. But yeah, I mean, there are so many things that you could do with so many different properties. And I know it can be a really sort of fashionable to say, oh no, they're out of ideas. But to me, when I talk about doing these types of stories or recreations or re-explorations, the way that I try to approach it is that a lot of these stories and characters, not all, but a lot of them are the blockbuster entertainments of their day. And people aren't that really different, no matter what time period or when or where over history we are. We're all relatively similar. And so there are always things in these stories that excite and enthrall people. And it's just a matter of finding it and connecting what was exciting back then to what's exciting to people today. The shorthand I would use for that is that Hamlet and Batman have a lot in common. And, if you can find those things and tease them out, you can have a lot of fun with things.
There's a fun way to play with these characters in terms of perspective too, and we're doing more of that these days, but like looking at Superman from an actual like reality lens, like who the hell is this guy, and just it becomes like, what on earth is he doing? And what he thinks he's doing up with reality, what he's doing can be fascinating. Again, kind of deconstruct this hero model. And it turns out he's psychotic or whatever it is, Or like, you've seen that thing? Oh, it's so good. I love the internet for this. When they take Ralph Macchio's character in The Karate Kid and they're like, look what a jerk this guy was.
I mean, there's kind of a whole show about that now and on Netflix, the Cobra Kai show. And to me, it all starts with people love characters. And when you fall in love with something or when you become a fan of something, you kind of take that character in as a part of yourself. And so, I mean, I know when I was younger, I still do it today, whatever, I'll be honest. You really like things and you just think about them and you go, oh, what if they did this? Or wouldn't it be cool if they did that? And that character and that story starts to live inside of you. And so there's so much fertile ground for taking stories and just kind of pulling on them and tugging on them and putting them, especially if you're talking about classics or things in the public domain. What if you put them in a different time period? What if you put them, you mix up things? What interesting things can you learn about the world today? What interesting things can you learn about that original story? What interesting things can you discover about how life today differs from back then, or how it's exactly the same?
Yeah, I love it. I keep thinking of these characters that I want to run by, and I don't want the whole show to be about these things, but it's so fascinating. Like, I often look around and I think, what a remarkable world we live in. And 100 years ago, someone like Nikola Tesla or whoever, if you bring back Thomas Jefferson, when you look around and be like, you guys are assholes, send me back. And Nikola Tesla was a weird dude in his own time. He wouldn't be any less weird now. Would he look around and be like, I'm still going to be this weird dude?
It's entirely possible. Or, he may look at, I think it was The Prestige, the movie The Prestige, in which he was played by David Bowie. And he would probably go, hey, I like that. That's pretty good.
Yeah. Right. Anytime you get David Bowie to play you in a movie, pretty good.
Yeah, that works.
Why Shakespeare?
Look, I want to be able to say because he's Shakespeare, because he's, the best. Right. But we can be honest, like Shakespeare is hard if you don't want to work for it. It's, it's held up as the epitome, the bard, the greatest, playwright in Western literature. And yeah, okay, all that is true. And I buy that. But, we get exposed to it often as kids in classes where it is meant to feel like work. And I think that extends, that's not exclusive to Shakespeare. That's not exclusive to old stories. If you've ever tried to convince someone to watch something like, say, The Wire, and they go, oh my God, it's like so much work. And like, there's so many characters and I can't, it's that same impulse of like, this is hard. I have to work for this. Therefore it's not fun. Therefore I don't want to do it. I just happen to be wired in a way that when I was really, really young and I just saw a production of something that really set my mind on fire. But I always thought, hey, wow, this is like the main line to the history of our civilization. And I want to understand this more. And it's just become something that I find a lot of joy and fun in. The stuff is once you figure out like what some of the jokes are, and you can like do some of the translations, it's really funny. It's really smart. It's all really kind of heartfelt. And there's a reason these plays have stuck around for 400 years. Like there's a lot there. Sometimes you have to excavate a little bit to find the ways to do it so that it makes sense to a modern audience, but it's all there. It's all worth it.
As you know, we could go back a couple thousand years. I mean, Orpheus is a great character with a great storyline. For those who don't know, Orpheus is the guy that's like, my wife's dead, but not dead enough. I'm bringing her back. But you take that story and you can put it in a modern context, and maybe it's a romantic comedy and his friends just take him to a teddy bar, and they get him better at the grieving process. Or maybe it snaps and it breaks him, and this compromise he has to make and he just goes off who knows, right? But you can take that story and bring it into a modern context.
So, I mean, Orpheus is in the book. He is one of the characters in the book. And, he's a good example of how the process that I used to write this book. And so kind of just to give an overview of how the book is constructed, it's a collection of letters written to an advice columnist, Dear Abby or, Dan Savage or just, one of those kinds of people write into advice columns asking for help with their problems. And they sign them with names that aren't their own, Sleepless in Seattle and, whatever. Except the people who are writing in these letters with their problems are characters from across famous literature. And the person they're writing to is Antigone from the Greek tragedy, who has, died, gone to the underworld, somehow come back and has enormous amount of knowledge and empathy about the world, how the world works, especially for fictional characters, and who tries to help them through their dilemmas while also not spoiling their stories for them. Because, you can't be like, you're in a book, that it would be over pretty quickly. So Orpheus, so the challenge here, the fun, I should say, was in taking all of these individual characters and finding angles on them that would feel like they would not be out of place if you were reading an advice column today. So in Orpheus's case, what it specifically turned into was a discussion of, as the legend goes, Orpheus goes down to the underworld to get his love Eurydice back. And Hades says, fine, you can take him, you can take her. But here's the deal. You can't turn around and look and make sure she's there until you reach the surface. And so Orpheus is like walking and he can hear Eurydice behind him. And then he like stops hearing her. And it's like, oh my God, like, is she really there? Did Hades lie to me? Am I being scammed? And he turns around and sees that she was there but because he turned around, he loses her and she gets taken back to the underworld. So the point of that I tried to drill down on is that moment of doubt where Orpheus is like, I believe her. I don't believe him. Maybe I'm being scammed. What do I do? And trying to find in him that moment of like, I don't know if I should turn around or not. I don't know if I can resist this or not. And turning that into a question of trust. And who do you need to trust in this situation? Do you need to trust Hades? Do you need to trust Eurydice? Or is this really about trusting yourself? And the fear of what happens if you're wrong. And so to try and sort of take this mythological situation and turn it into something that we all face in our regular life.
Is there room to make a second one where you take some of the literary authors and like, I always think about Aristophanes, right? And like, he's like, hey, where are my royalty checks? Antigone, how do I find a lawyer to represent a dead guy whose every idea has been stolen?
That could be fun. That could be really fun. I could see Christopher Marlowe having a lot to complain about. But yeah, no, I mean, the fun of this has been, once we kind of landed on this concept, I mean, there are so many things you could do with this. And indeed, the first challenge was figuring out who goes in the book and who doesn't. And I had lists and lists and lists of all these characters. And I've got a whiteboard up in my office where I had like all of these cards up and like, okay, they're going to be in, they're going to be out. They're going to go in this chapter. They're going to go in that chapter. And it was just a continual process of trying to figure out who to include. And, I tried really hard. I wanted to have the gender split between characters as equitable as possible, which meant there were a lot of characters, male characters, there were a lot more of them in classic literature. There are a lot more kind of names above the title that are male characters. So there were a lot of people on my board originally who didn't make it in because I wanted to make room for a more balanced division. At the same time, we did a lot of classics and public domain, but I wanted to, as much as possible, try and include some more recent characters and some things that maybe are less known in the Western canon, sort of at the upper reaches, but still important, or things that are of more recent vintage that are being considered more and more crucial as time goes on. So the talented Mr. Ripley is in there. American Psycho is in there. And, I could have done more. We sort of waited to get an all clear from the legal department on whether or not this counted as fair use, as transformative. And then when they finally said, yeah, it's okay, it was relatively late. So I could have done more, but I'm fine with what we ended up on with.
It's funny what counts as fair use. Like on YouTube, we constantly are trying to battle that battle, and it's like so clear to the creator. Like, yeah, this is fair use, of course, but the rights holder, it's a different story. So I can appreciate how challenging that is. Who was an inner circle? Like, no doubt about it, these 5 characters I'm writing about, no matter what.
So Hamlet and Ophelia were always going to be in. And in fact, there was an earlier version where they wrote in multiple times. There was a version where they were going to have like 2 or 3 letters where over the course of the book, it would sort of become a he said, she said. I let that go. I was like, this will be fun, but we need the space for other people. Ishmael from Moby Dick was always going to be in there. I'm a huge fan of that book. And that was another one where I wanted him to write in multiple times. Just be like, hi, me again. So remember, I was like on this boat with this crazy guy. Well, but we kept it to 1 with Ishmael. Who else was always going to be in? From the very beginning, I knew we were going to have 2 letters, one from Dr. Jekyll and one from Mr. Hyde.
Oh, great.
That was definitely always going to be in there from the beginning. And yeah, I'm trying to think of other ones off the top of my head that I knew from the start were going to be there. I knew there was going to be a heavy Jane Austen presence just because I love the works of Jane Austen, and there's a lot to work with. It was more a question of who from Jane Austen wasn't going to be in this book. I definitely wanted someone from Dracula, who ended up being Jonathan Harker, and I definitely wanted someone from a Lovecraft book. That was more challenging to figure out because Lovecraft isn't really known for his individual characters. So it took some work to figure out exactly who that was going to be.
Why Lovecraft?
Oh, just because Lovecraft is fun.
Okay.
And Lovecraft is like the original shared universe. Like Marvel, everyone thinks Marvel invented this. This goes all the way back to like Lovecraft created this sort of mythology, and then all of these other writers that were his contemporaries built on it. And then writers ever since have been sort of taking stuff from the Lovecraftian mythos and kind of injecting it into their own stories. And so he's a great, I mean, Lovecraft himself, as we, have learned over the last several years, is not the greatest dude in and of himself, but the kind of foundation of the world that he created and what other people have done with it have created this really fun shared universe to play in. And so I wanted to definitely include some of that.
How do you turn this off? I mean, as you're talking about it, I'm having idea after idea. I mean, I'm going to keep pitching them because I think they're hilarious, and maybe some of them will be a little bit Dennis Millerian, but like actually you have Goethe write in, and you're like, listen, just write an essay or whatever, and just or something, because it's like, just get through it. Or Job writes in and God's like, or the writer's like, God's fucking with you. Just
but see, that was a really interesting thing that I hit on very early in the writing process, which is how much can Aunt Antigone tell them? Right? Because and so one of the first characters that I worked on at the very, very beginning was Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind. And it was a real challenge to figure out first of all, whether or not Scarlett O'Hara would ever actually ask for help from anyone, which is debatable. But assuming that she would ask someone for advice, the idea of what should the person who's giving Scarlett O'Hara advice tell her? And I realized that if it was me personally, I'd be like, Scarlett, get over yourself. None of this is important. Take a look around you at the horrible, horrible shit that you're in the middle of, that you are benefiting from. And it doesn't matter who you marry, grow up. But the thing is anyone who's going to buy this book, or who is going to enjoy, or is going to want to read an advice letter from Scarlett O'Hara, is going to be someone who loves Scarlett O'Hara. And so the challenge became how to find a voice to answer these questions that wasn't about telling them what was going to happen in their own story, telling them that they're wrong, or telling them that they're wrong in a way that diminishes their character, or anybody who might care about that character, not spoiling what was going to happen, but sort of trying to tease out what might just be outside the character's perception, but still within the world of the story. And so once I kind of found that, and Scarlett was the first one where I was able to figure that out, was this is what the advice, the agony ant should be saying. And that's where Antigone's voice came from. And so then that kind of became someone who's like, oh yes, I know this is hard. Let me try and see this from your perspective, while widening your perspective a little bit. And why should you believe me? Well, you think you have problems with your family. My father, they named the Oedipus complex after him. So I've been there, you can trust me. And that really unlocked everything else.
That's great. Yeah, the rules for Antigone and how she interacts with the people is interesting. Who didn't make the cut that you wanted to get in there, but it just didn't work out?
A lot of people.
I bet.
The last cut was Miss Havisham from Great Expectations. She was on the board until the very end. I just couldn't find the right place for her. Tom Joad from The Grapes of Wrath, Colonel Kurtz from Hearts of Darkness. Who else? Lots of Shakespeare characters. The nurse from Romeo and Juliet, Falstaff from multiple plays, Willie Loman from Death of a Salesman, Stanley Kowalski from Streetcar Named Desire. I initially had Humbert from Lolita, but then when I started working on it, I actually found that it would. I thought it was going to be more interesting to do Charlotte Hayes from Lolita instead. So he got bumped. And yeah, the list goes on and on. I've got tons of them.
Yeah, I bet. And then do you think you'll write another one? Or, I mean, obviously you do this. I mean, I don't want to say you're a one-trick pony, but this is one of the things that you are known for doing.
Yeah, I would love to do another round of these. Whether or not, if people want to click on the link and buy some copies of the book, that would help.
Yes,
that would help make the case that we could do more. But yeah, it was. I would love to do more. It was a ton of fun. Yeah.
And then, do you remember? I'm just going to keep doing this to you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I can't help it, but it's such a great idea, and it's something that I love. I love thinking about these things. Remember the episode when everybody on Brady Bunch wrote in to the advice column lady? Do you remember that one?
I don't remember that one.
Yeah, they all wrote into Dear Abby or whichever one it was, but one of the, and then they were actually on the show, and then they all had written in as the family was dealing with some kind of crisis and everything.
Yeah.
So what if you did that with like the Cat in the Hot Tin Roof cast? You got a depressed guy.
That'd be fun. That would be fun.
A horny lady,
Yeah. 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 I think I do have in here 2 of the 4 March sisters from Little Women are in here. I definitely could get the other 2 also, right. And we could get them all together. That would work. Yeah. And I should say you even mentioned Goethe before.
Yeah.
I do have a Goethe character in here, and he's also one of the ones that I knew from the beginning I wanted to be in here. He's Werther from The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is not a book that tons of people know. But I wanted it in there because for a very specific reason, which is when I went to college, I took a class in Western literature and we read this book. And there was a moment in this book that I've never forgotten because we turned it became like the running joke in the class where Werther falls in love with this girl and he's convinced that she is the perfect person for him, even though she's married. She's perfect for him because they both love the same poet, the poet Klopstock. And so like just Klopstock as this sort of thing that you say when you're just overcome with, beauty and joy became this sort of running joke throughout the semester in that class. And when I was like, oh, wait a minute, you know what? That's the equivalent of thinking, I love her because we're fans of the same band. Like that's the same sort of impulse that people still have today. And I was like, I definitely need to include that just for the 3 people out in the world that might read that and go, oh, Klopstock, I remember that.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. And then it's a super important book. I mean, it's a shame that more people don't know about it. And then doesn't he end up living with the husband and wife for a while as he convalesces or whatever?
Yes.
Yeah.
He lives with them for a while. And then in the end, he kills himself because it just hurts too much. And it set off like a wave of copycat suicides, which, goes to show that pop culture has not changed.
Not one bit.
Centuries. Yeah.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And I always include them together because I think that they're all laudable, but how come the Bronte sisters, and Jane Austen, how come they're so rich with content and the ability to reconstitute what they do? I mean, it seems like every year something from that canon of books, putting them all together, something comes out every year.
I mean, I don't know if I can speak for the Austen and Bronte estates, but I mean, to my impression, it's just they part of it is what happens when you get canonized, when it's like, oh, this stuff is in the canon. Therefore, it just becomes more available. More people are exposed to it. And so it just becomes more fodder for the continual churn of creations and recreations. Part of it is that some of it's just really damn great. I remember, I guess it was 2 years ago now, seeing the most recent film adaptation of Little Women, which I just adored. And Little Women was not a book that I read when I was growing up. I think I'd seen like the movie in the 90s, but it had never really kind of made an impression of me. But, when you do it right and when you put the right lens on it, it makes something from 200 years ago feel as vital and alive as today. And it's always, I think, interesting and fun and enjoyable to keep kind of measuring today against the past and sort of seeing how these stories hold up, how they change, how our understanding of them change. And then when they drift too far away, someone else can come along and say, no, what this is really is about is that it's about this. And you have a whole new appreciation of the original story. And I mean, some people are just wired that way. And I'm one of those people. I love, seeing old versions of stories and new versions of stories and how they compare to each other. And yeah, it's just fun.
When you look at writing a book like this, how much does marketability, I mean, look, as a showrunner, you've got to sell this damn thing. So how much of that is impacted in how you construct, how much of the story is impacted by your need to be marketable?
I mean, I don't want to say all of it and I don't want to say none of it. I tend to try and think of what I'm writing as providing a service to someone. It's not really about, here's my brilliant thing and you're either going to like it and you're not. It's more like, if someone is going to approach this, in what context are they going to see it? What are they going to, how are they told about it? What are they going to think about it? What is the experience I want them to have? And marketability is a part of that. I will say that a lot of how this book was originally conceived was around a very specific marketing plan, which I thought was brilliant. It wasn't my idea, but I was like, yeah, this is great. And the idea is that, everyone knows someone. Sometimes they are that person, but if you're not that person, we all know people in our lives who love literature, who love classic stories, and who you're like, oh, if I need to get a gift for them, I always know I can get them something related to classic literature and they'll like it. And so this book was conceived of as that thing. And the plan was, we'll put it near the registers at the bookstores. So when people are checking out, they'll see the cover, the incredibly designed cover, which I when I saw it, I remember just being like, oh, I'm so lucky. This cover's beautiful. They'll see the cover and they'll be like, oh, hey, that looks cool. I know that would be a perfect gift for whoever. The problem was, we're in the middle of a global pandemic and the bookstores are closed. So that didn't really work. But we're trying to make up for that through other avenues, and a lot of word of mouth, and I'm trying to put it in front of as many people as possible. And we'll see how that goes.
One of the things too about what you're doing, there's the Dennis Miller versus Family Guy problem. I mean, we're talking about Goethe and Werther, and you and I have an understanding of this. But if you haven't done the work, you're not going to get a lot of Dennis Miller's jokes unless you get the fact that not getting it is part of the joke. But then there's the Family Guy approach where you tell the same joke and then you illustrate the joke so you can understand it. And then you go back to it a third time because it's still funny. So how do you balance the ability? I mean, look, we all know Shakespeare, but do we know Hamlet? Do we know Richard III? Maybe, maybe not.
You're right. Absolutely. And so, one of the ways that we approach this, writing this and structuring this book was, I knew from the start that there were going to be tons of people who would read it and recognize some characters and not recognize others. And that's fine. My hope on some level is that some people will, encounter a character that they didn't know and find them interesting enough to want to go and, read the original book. And I know that actually happened to me during the writing of this in a few places where I was like, oh, I need this character from this book. I don't really know this one that well. Let me do the reading myself and sort of figure out, do I have a take on this? And through that, I found there were a couple of books that I hadn't read before that I was like, oh my God, I love this. I'm so glad that this process led me to this. One of those, the biggest example I'll give of that is Steinbeck's East of Eden, which I was like, God, I really need some Steinbeck in here. And I kind of looked at a couple of things, and I picked up Beast of Eden, and I started reading it, and I could not put it down. I was like, oh my God, this is fantastic. And so putting Kate Trask from East of Eden became like a huge discovery for me, and that was fantastic. The other thing that we've done is we've kind of tried to turn the book into a little bit of a game where each letter is signed with a pen name. They're not signed by the name of the character. If you want to, you don't have to. If you want to, you can approach each letter like it's a riddle and see how long it takes you through the context clues to figure out who the character is, what book they're from, what situation they're talking about. And I knew from the start that everyone was going to have different experiences doing that. Some people would get a character in the first line, or the next character they'd get all the way through and they'd be like, I don't know who this is. Or some variation between for everyone. But we also didn't want to make it like too difficult. So all the characters are listed in the table of contents. You can just sort of go to the table of contents and it'll tell you who it is. But if you want to have the guessing game experience, you can do that. I will also say there is one letter in there that has a secret code. I will not say who it is. I will not say what the code is. But to my knowledge, no one has found it yet.
Okay. All right. How many letters are there in the book?
There are 73 letters across 9 chapters. And the chapters are divided by theme. So like one chapter is about young love, and one chapter is about, career, and one chapter is about education. And that was a fun discovery to make, because initially when I was first thinking about it, I was like, all right, we do a chapter of Shakespeare characters, and then like maybe you do a chapter of Gothic horror characters. And very quickly that just started to feel boring. And also, I was like, I don't want to have any part of an argument over what belongs in the modernist chapter and what doesn't. Like, that's just a rabbit hole you never get out of. But when I hit upon the idea of what if we grouped together completely disparate characters who were all talking about similar issues, and that felt more appropriate for the advice column setting.
I want to show everybody the book cover too, by the way. It's clever because of the advice column, and so it's torn out and put in there. So and definitely go to Amazon and get the book. You can also go to Jay's website too. It'll be there as well. But you can hear how fun this book is. And I love that there's a riddle in there, and it makes it even more fun. And it seems like it's something that you can read at your own pace because you're not locked into a really strict format and function. And I swear to God, I'm editing out so many things that I want to mention, like, oh my gosh, this would be great. Oh my gosh, this would be great. But it's just I love that you were doing this. Do you fear being a one-trick pony with this stuff? I mean, you've done this a couple of times. What are your thoughts?
I don't fear it because, I mean, we are in a golden age of retellings and reimaginings, and the same approach that I use to turn Hamlet or Moby Dick into advice column letters is the same approach I could use to turn a novel into a TV show or a comic book into a stage play. Like it's the same tool set. So It doesn't really matter what the source material is, and it doesn't really matter where the endpoint is. It's the same sort of exploration process. And a lot of that kind of comes out of my original background was in the theater. And in a lot of ways, this is not too dissimilar from the job of a theater director, which is you're handed a play script and then you have to create this live kind of encapsulation of it. And I think that's where I started, and I just sort of followed that impulse where it's led, and it's led here.
How much has Antigone talked to us? Is she writing this book as if she's writing it and then collating these letters together?
Yes, and each chapter has a little intro from Antigone where she talks about, the particular topic that is going to be in the next chapter, and references a thing from her own life. So there are little mentions of her father Oedipus, her uncle Creon, her boyfriend Haman, and like all of these characters from the original Greek tragedies. She's talking about them as if that's her own family and her own experience.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's again, I just I love everything about the concept. It's fantastic. So many characters come to mind with this whole thing. It's neat. Do people make livings? I mean, that's such a newspaper thing, being an advice columnist. Is that? I mean, it's changed into something else, right?
I don't really know. I mean, I read a lot of advice columnists when I was preparing to do this, and from what I can tell, like it's one part of a larger career as a writer. I would say the advice columnist who influenced me and this book the most would be Heather Havrilesky. Who writes a column called Ask Polly. She also has a version of it called Ask Molly, which is Polly's evil twin. But much like any other kind of writer these days, you have to kind of have multiple channels of where your work is getting out. So I know that she writes for a number of online outlets. She writes books. She has a Substack newsletter where you can pay to support her, and it's kind of what the writing gig has become these days, is you just got to write lots of different things and lots of different channels and hope you can cobble it all together into making a living.
I was going to ask you, does Antigone give any bad advice? Does she ever do it on purpose? Does she just get one wrong or anything at all?
I think there are a couple of places where you might say that she gets it wrong because maybe she gives the benefit of the doubt to a character that we know doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
There are a couple of places where perhaps she is a little more empathetic towards people than maybe the reader might want them to be. Patrick Bateman from American Psycho is, I think, a good example of that. And yeah, I don't know if I would want to judge Antigone's advice good/bad too much, because it was more about trying to find the core question behind the question for her. Yeah. I mean, and in reality, like, none of these characters are going to listen to any of her advice, because they're all, they don't have control over their own actions. So yeah.
I actually got Twitter and I broke up over a similar thing. I made a joke about all of the desires to impeach all the presidents, and I made a joke about how if you mess with old rough and ready Zachary Taylor, who's, by the way, everybody, been dead for 170 years, he's going to punch you in the mouth by proxy. So in this scenario, a dead president who's been dead would have to be impeached, and then he would have to rise up and command his minions to punch you in the mouth. Clearly a joke. And I was inciting violence. So, anyhow, the world has no sense of humor. I wanted to ask you this. So you're spending time in these texts, even if you're familiar with them, you're looking at it. And I know that, like, when I read Steinbeck, I think I should never grab a pen ever again, because this guy in 3 words can say something and describe it so perfectly. I mean, even in, like, with his book, Travels with Charlie, he talks about a star-rattled sky and his flypaper youth. These are things that are just incredibly descriptive and perfect. What did you find when you were going through, Goethe and all of these different incredible authors?
I mean, yeah, it can be intimidating. You're like, I had early on kind of spent a little more time trying to do a little more specific style pastiche. Most of that kind of got evolved out. There's still a few places, I think, where it's in there. I think Lady Macbeth speaks with a little more like forsooths or things like that. But that kind of, like, it just sort of felt like I didn't want to try and do that too much, because there was no end to that. Like, I could spend forever to get that right. What I did discover is it really allowed me to take some time with some of these texts and think about them in ways more deeply and in different ways than if, say, I was just reading something just to like, oh, I want to, read this because it's fun and I'm reading it.
Yes.
And it allowed me to re-encounter some things that I had read. A lot of these things I hadn't read or seen since I was in high school or college. And I had an idea of what they were or how I felt about them. And the process of writing this book allowed me to re-engage with some things and discover some books and some of this work to be much more kind of affecting than I remember. And I think there is no better example of that than the play Our Town, which is sort of become kind of like a shorthand joke for, experimental theater. And look, we only have a budget of $7.50. So here's a ladder and that's the town. And like, yeah. And like, that's what I remember. I remember it being, but I, reread Our Town while working on this. And it was just, I think for the first time ever, I really kind of felt just how beautiful a play it is. And it really, really got to me. It really, really touched me while I was working on it. And, it was part of the final part of writing this book, which was a very, very difficult process. The last few weeks of writing the book happened when the pandemic was starting. And while I was writing it, my father got sick. And 2 days after I turned the book in, he died from COVID. And all throughout that, it was such a feeling of helplessness of like, he and my mother live back east. I'm in Los Angeles, so I couldn't go home. I couldn't see him. I could barely talk to him. And I would just sit here feeling completely helpless and not know what to do. And the only thing I could do was just keep working. And it became, writing the end of the book became sort of this refuge that, was able to sort of keep me going. And I was able to, my father was really, really excited when I told him I was writing this book. And he sent me a bunch of like suggestions of characters.
Of course.
And I ended up using 2 of them in that last chapter. And the last chapter is the theme of the last chapter is endings. And I used.
Was this coincidental or did this?
It was coincidental. Like I had thought, hey, that'll be a good thing because so many of these stories are these tragedies or these like characters face their deaths or they face these like huge turning points. So endings, that'll be a good final one. And I ended up using 2 of the characters my father suggested. One was Sidney Carton from A Tale of Two Cities.
Okay.
And the other one was Yossarian from Catch-22. And Catch-22 is one of my father's favorite books. And he had always told me, I remember hearing him tell this story about when he was in college. And seeing someone spray painted graffiti on the wall he went to City College of New York. And so someone at City College of New York had spray painted graffiti on the side of the library that said, Yossarian is alive and well and living in Sweden. And so I was like, oh, hey, like, let me put Yossarian in the book and have him, write about like, I'm going to try and row to Sweden. And like, is that crazy? And I was, was really looking forward to, writing that so he could see it. And that never came to pass, unfortunately. But there was a day like in the middle of that and really in the thick of it where I was like, I have to keep working and I don't know how to like keep going. And I've got a deadline, but I just can't figure out what I'm supposed to do or how I'm supposed to do this. And I realized that the person who needed advice from Aunt Antigone was me.
Mm-hmm.
So that day I sat down and I wrote a letter to Aunt Antigone from me. And I got to the end of that letter, and then I just kept writing Aunt Antigone's reply to me. And I ended up putting those letters in the afterword of the book and sort of kind of telling the story, this version of the story. But yeah, I delivered the book on April 3rd, and on April 1st, my father died, and he never got to see it. And so the book is dedicated to him. And you know, it's the dedication reads, hang on, I want to get it right. I want to make sure I don't forget it. The dedication is for my father, who is alive and well and living in Sweden. I hope wherever he is, Sweden or somewhere else, he somehow sees this.
That's it. We're not talking anymore. That's
okay.
There's
Sorry.
no point in going any further.
Yeah, that was. Yeah, I know. It was hard. It was really hard, but it was also in this context where I found myself reading Our Town, which is all about, like, you know, the whole last act of Our Town are all the characters who lived in this town and who have died and who are now kind of like observing from the cemetery. And it was just really poignant, really beautiful. And, you know, it felt like the right place to end everything. And I wanted to end it on a hopeful note. So it actually ends with Persephone leaving. Persephone writes the last letter, and it's about her, you know, going to the underworld, but then coming back up to the surface one day. And so sort of try to end it on an up note. But yeah.
Well, listen, I appreciate you coming on the show. I mean, I want to talk more and more, but I think we just, you know, we really nailed the landing there. So we'll just have to do another one. And just everybody should go out and support this book. It's such a beautiful idea. It's so entertaining, and I just love it. Thank you again, Jay, so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, go to Jay Bushman and watch all his stuff. Support this dude. Look what he's doing. Look at the emotion he puts into this stuff. How can you say no to that? And by the way, then you get to go read a bunch of literary classics. Like I have to go read Our Town because I can remember that I was in it, and then off stage I played a chicken, but I remember which guy even was in it.
Yeah. It's all just sitting in the back of your head somewhere, but a lot of these things are classics for a good reason.